Okay, everyone, this is my spoiler review of X-Men the Animated Series, Season 3, Episode 11, called Comfort. This originally came out February 5th, 1995, and it actually originally came out as Episode 15 of Season 3. So as you'll see on Disney Plus, if you're rewatching the show, everything is a different order now. We're getting into this game where what the original release date was compared to what it lines up perfectly in the story now is so different, so it's kind of all over the place, but we're just going to follow that Disney Plus order. Before I jump into my review, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I have a lot of people following on TikTok, but I need some more help on the YouTube, so it'd be really much appreciated. Now, this episode opens with a shot of the Kirby Glen storage facility. This is reference to co-creator Jack Kirby, and the number 1917 is the year of his birth. So it was a nice little Easter egg, and it's an awesome entrance for the character I've been waiting to see in this show, Iceman, aka Bobby Drake, who just comes with so much great feelings when you see him as an X-Men fan, being one of the original X-Men. And I love this episode and how they honor that original group, which we will get into. But it's interesting because we're seeing a story we've seen a lot in the show where Jubilee feels like she's being treated like a child by Professor X, but it really worked in this episode for me because it's showing you that downside of Professor X where he's too strict, and it'll directly relate to how he treats someone like Bobby Drake in this episode and has the wrong approach, and that it works that Jubilee actually is a renegade herself like Bobby Drake and goes against that to kind of point out like, no, you guys are wrong in this situation, which I thought was really effective in this episode. It was one of Jubilee's best episodes as well. I thought it was interesting though, and Cerebro warns of mutant activity and shares that Iceman's power is formation and manipulation of ice, and Jubilee goes, but Storm's in Africa, which is interesting because I always thought that where like Storm almost negates the powers of Iceman in a sense because she can also conjure up some ice if needed. So I thought that was an interesting thing, and I like to actually acknowledge that. Speaking of Storm though, just with season 3, I feel like she's really been sidelined. You know, she's my favorite character, so I'm a little biased, but she really got a lot of time in the first 2 seasons, so I can see why they pulled back a little bit. But I mean, I feel like she's not even in the show at this point anymore. It's really weird. Now we'll see Cyclops just as frustrating this episode because it really shows his goody two shoes side, and he reminds me a lot of Captain America in the Avengers, where he really is highlighted as this leader who's honorable but a lot by the book. And it really is fascinating his reaction to seeing Bobby's back, and he's like, that guy's trouble. But Beast actually sticks up for him, and he's like, he's a free spirit, he's not a renegade like you're saying. And you'll see Professor X is constantly toying with how to handle someone like Bobby because he knows he comes with that spirit that can be disruptive, but you have to be smart about it. Where Cyclops is full on, let's not even bother with the guy. Now, Iceman's powers look so good in this animation. I was really impressed how they did it justice in this show. I really love him sliding on his own ice like he does in the comics so much, and he really did in the final battle get to do really cool things like making a shield for Wolverine. They just went all out, and you could tell how much they love Iceman themselves and giving him so much great moments. Now, Wolverine has amazing lines per usual in this episode, and he goes, okay pal, you come easy or I get to make cocktail ice for 100. That was so funny. And there's a really cool strange moment with Professor X I liked in this episode where we get to see him use his powers, but he projects big monsters to scare off the soldiers. I thought that was a really cool scene they threw in there that you might actually even miss. Now, Beast also has great lines in this episode. One comes when he responds to Jubilee, where Jubilee's like, what's with those two, talking about Bobby and Professor X? I've never seen the professor so angry. And Beast goes, it's a surrogate father-son dynamic with unresolved issues of dominance. I thought that was such a great line and sums it up perfectly. And then Bobby says he left the X-Men because he chose to think for himself instead of always playing the good soldier boy. And Wolverine goes, ooh, them's fighting words, because he knows he's talking about Cyclops. That was such a good moment. Now, Professor X puts Bobby in this gravity suspension device to make sure he doesn't hurt anybody because he doesn't trust him. Now, that's a big theme in this episode about trust, because you see that Jubilee feels for Bobby, and she starts to really feel for him when she sneaks into Cerebro to learn about Iceman. And my favorite moment of this episode, one of my favorite in the whole show, is seeing the X-Men in their early days on the screen. And you see Beast before he was blue doing like little handstand, and it's really cool. And how they talk about Bobby Drake was a second member of the X-Men, so they give a lot of love to this character who's so underutilized and kind of forgotten a lot in the X-Men lore. And Jubilee has a great line here because Wolverine's like, he was before my time. From what I hear, he's dangerous to have around. And Jubilee's like, kind of like you. So she's calling him out for his hypocrisy. And that will happen again with Beast, because Beast says to Bobby that he needs to trust Professor X. Without trust, the world can be a lonely place. But this is so hypocritical to me because the problem here is Beast, Wolverine, Cyclops, Professor X not trusting Bobby. So that is where it's great that Professor X starts realizing his faults as the episode goes on, and that Jubilee calls them out for it. But what's also interesting is Beast asks Bobby about Lorna Dane, so we get her first mention in the show, an appearance we'll see later on. And we learn that Bobby left the X-Men because they nearly lost Lorna, and that Lorna went with him, and they stopped fighting. Villains now are in love. It's cool we get to see in this time. They had the Daily Bugle article written by J. Jonah Jameson, so that was a nice Easter egg, and he wrote that article about the mutant crisis. But he came home one day and Lorna was gone. And remember, as he said, Lorna was sounding more and more like Xavier, so that's where they were going toe to toe. But all of this sympathy that Jubilee has for Bobby really saves the day. She breaks Bobby out because she overhears all this backstory, but they will go back together, Bobby and Jubilee, and get caught by X Factor. So it was cool we got to see Forge here again, even though it was in the shadows. Now, while the X-Men are on their way to the scene in the Blackbird, I love when X says to Cyclops, Scott, losing Bobby again has made me realize that sometimes good leadership is knowing when not to give orders. And then Wolverine steals the scene going, don't worry, I won't say, I told you so. So good. And there's a great line with Jubilee because Cyclops says to Jubilee, how could you let this misfit escape, talking about Bobby? And she's like, because he needed us. The professor and the rest of you guys are too busy condemning him to notice it. Really, really great writing there, and one of the best just written episodes with the theme going on. Really well done. And X says Jubilee's right. I fell back into my old role as Bobby's disapproving headmaster. I should have found a new role as his friend. And it reminds you too, like Beast had said about him being a surrogate father figure to him. Yeah, it also comes with becoming an adult and knowing that Bobby was the youngest X-Men, that you have to also learn to readjust your relationship with each other. And that really made sense that, yeah, it's over time now, he should see him more as a friend than actually being this commander on him. Now, it's cool we get to see, like I said, Forge, but we also get to see Quicksilver again and Havoc. I was laughing hysterically when Havoc and Cyclops are just circling each other before they fight. And there's no acknowledgement of them being brothers, but they hint at it, obviously, like the lore, because their powers don't affect each other, so you know it's there. It's also interesting that Iceman, I love the character because he's full of puns. There's something about ice and freezing and puns that just works together. Reminds me a lot of Mr. Freeze, of course, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I love Mr. Freeze. And I love Wolverine when he's fighting Multiple Man, and he says, what's this, a 2-for-1 sale? And Multiple Man's like, no, a baker's dozen. And the funniest moment, just visually, of this episode, it was just hysterical if you watch it back, is Jubilee is just screaming, and there's something about this show with the screaming in it that's always terrifying, but it's this intense scream Jubilee, but she's just spinning in Quicksilver's whirlwind. It just keeps going. I thought that was so funny. And it was great to have Professor X here guide them telepathically to win this battle, and having them switch up who they were facing. Very cool, and that's some of the best Professor X stuff. Like I said in my previous reviews, I love when they show him telepathically commanding them, guiding them with strategy like they did so well in the original run of the comics. I like Professor X is a little insecure and almost a little threatened by another mutant group that's a secret mutant group that's doing good for mutants, with learning about the X Factor from Forge. And poor Bobby, Lorna actually left him by faking her disappearance, which is a brutal way to dump somebody. And she's now with Havoc. So Bob's sorry, man. And the X-Men offer Bobby a spot. At least Professor X apologizes to him. It feels a little rushed the end here. I wish they had a little more moment to breathe. And even maybe Cyclops talking to Bobby would have been nice and resolving their conflict. But they offer Bobby a spot in the X-Men again. And he realizes it's still the same. It would still be something where they're kind of butting heads. And he kind of just flies off into the sunset, which was nice. But just felt so rushed that end. It's the only criticism I have of this episode on an episode I actually really do love. So that brings points down for me a little bit. But I thought they did such a good job giving justice to Iceman. I want to see more of him in the show. He was great here. And like I said, I'll really always remember them showing the old X-Men group together. I thought that was so cool to see an animation like this. And it made me think, just with the MCU and X-Men 97 coming, they also have a door to do an animated version of the original group and go back in time. I think that'd be really sick. But I'm going to give this one an 8.8. Let me know what you thought of it down below. I read every comment, try to respond as many as I can, and hit that sub button so you don't miss one of my reviews of this show. And I do a bunch of X-Men stuff, polls, reviewing figures, you name it. And I'll see you next time.